Thank you very much. I'm here to talk today about free speech in the American Academy. And I'd like to begin with one of my favorite news stories. And I can't believe I'm saying these words, this was a wonderful story relating to Israel, and it appeared in the New York Times. The New York Times reported some years ago how in Helena, Montana, that's right in the middle of America, a Chabad rabbi by the name of Chaim Brook showed up at the state capitol in December for a menorah lighting. He was briefly checked out by an officer and a bomb-sniffing dog, who then followed him into the rotunda. During the ceremony, the Times tells us, Rabbi Brook noticed that, quote, the dog sat at attention, watching the ceremony with a peculiar expression on its face, a look of intense interest, end quote. It was the dog recognized the menorah. After the ceremony, the police officer came over and said, I'm Officer Foskett, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? And he explained that the officer's dog, whose name was Mikey, was raised from puppyhood in Israel, where he was trained as a bomb-sniffing dog by Tzahal. And so, when the Montana Police Department discovered that it was cheaper to import an Israeli dog rather than spend $25,000 on an American dog, Mikey made Yuridah and was brought all the way to Montana. But there was a problem, the officer explained, which was, and I'm quoting the Times, the problem the officer explained was that Mikey had been trained entirely in Hebrew. When Officer Foskett got Mikey, he was handed a list of a dozen Hebrew commands and expressions, like Hishaer, Chapes, and Kelev Tov. He made flashcards and tried practicing with Mikey, but poor Mikey didn't respond. Officer Foskett, who is not Jewish, suspected he wasn't pronouncing the words properly. He tried a Hebrew instructional audiobook from the local library, but no luck. The dog didn't always understand what he was being ordered to do, or maybe Mikey was just using his owner's bad pronunciation as an excuse to ignore him. I'll just add, Mikey's a Saber. He looks down on American Hebrew. Says the Times, either way, the policeman needed a rabbi, and now he had found one. They worked through a few pronunciations, and the rabbi, Chaim Brook, is now on call to work with Mikey and his owner as needed. Officer Foskett has since learned to pronounce the tricky Israeli sound, and Mikey has become a new star on the police force. The two were even brought in by the Secret Service to work on a recent presidential visit. So, the Times writes, all is well in the Jewish community here because the Hasidic rabbi is helping the Montana cop speak Hebrew to his dog. It is good news all around. The officer keeps the capital safe, and the Hebrew pooch is feeling more at home hearing his native tongue. But, the Times tells us, the big winner is the rabbi, a recent arrival from Brooklyn who is working hard, against tough odds, to bring his Lubavitch movement to Montana. He has been scouring the state for anyone who can speak Hebrew, and is elated to have found a German shepherd he can talk to. End quote. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to the issue of free speech, I want to propose this small, simple story as a sublime metaphor for the spiritual crisis facing the West in general and the American Academy in particular, because it involves, in America at least, at its essence, a loss of the Hebraic way of thinking, of the Hebraic conception of light, and of what it means to search for truth itself. Let me explain what I mean. If any of you come from Israel to America and wander around some of the older, more distinguished universities in the United States, and you study the seals of these institutions, you will find etched into the buildings a fascinating feature. Hebrew words with Hebrew letters, usually involving both the name of God and the theme of awe, of light. Thus, you will find the seal of Columbia University, which features the Shem Hashem, the name of God, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, with rays of light emanating from it, along with the Hebrew words, Uriel, the Lord is my light. Go up to New Hampshire and visit Dartmouth, and you will see the seal adorned with the Hebrew names of God, Kel Shakai, again, with light pouring forth from the very Hebrew words. But perhaps the most interesting of all, ladies and gentlemen, is the seal of Yale University, which features a book within which appear two Hebrew words, Urim v'Tumim, along with a Latin translation, Lux et Veritas, light and truth. Why is it there? Yale professor Dan Oren points out that the phrase Urim v'Tumim appears in the middle verse of the Torah, which means that the book is meant to represent the Chumash. Light is a metaphor for enlightenment, reason, the search for truth. The symbol, as he explains, is meant to connote that for Yale and for some of the major American universities in their origin, the Hebraic tradition was seen as emphasizing the joining of faith and reason, light and truth. An argument, in other words, that free inquiry and the embrace of revelation can, and indeed for these founders must, coexist. Of course, there are few today at Yale who can read the words Urim v'Tumim on its seal, and even less who understand its context. And this points to something striking. It was surely assumed by many that as faith disappeared from much of the domain of American universities, that freedom of inquiry, the unfettered exchange of ideas would increase. But in fact, the opposite has occurred. The search for truth that is done through the free exchange of ideas has been replaced by progressive notions of social justice. And this gives the lie to the very seal of the institution. Thus, New York University's Jonathan Haidt, an alumnus of Yale, reflected that, quote, "When I arrived at Yale in 1981, veritas, truth, was written in stone above Phelps Gate." That's one of the major gates in the university. "We were told this is an institution committed to truth. But since the 1990s," he said, "increasing numbers of universities seem to be chiseling out truth and inserting change. And not just any kind of change, but social justice in particular," end quote. And in the last couple of years, things have gotten much worse. As the scholar Yasha Munk notes, we have gone from a rejection of free expression at the academy to a new motto: silence is violence, where students are not even allowed to keep their ideas to themselves often, but are pressured by other students to join the collective in enunciating their loyalty to progressivism. How has all this come to be? And why is it precisely the loss of faith that has preceded this phenomenon? The answer is actually complex, because the abandonment of free speech in the American Academy went through several stages, and I'm going to briefly summarize them tonight. In the biblical tradition's joining of faith and reason, our own sense of self-worth derives from the seeking of truth. And what matters most is whether God witnesses the integrity in which we live and the integrity in which we seek truth. Thus, there's a wonderful quote from the play A Man for All Seasons, where Thomas More in Tudor England advises someone to become a teacher. So this man asks, "But if I'm a teacher, who would know it?" And Thomas More replies, "You, your students, and God." Not a bad audience, that. But the collapse of faith in academic institutions, the rejection of biblical teaching and tradition, ushered in not a secular embrace of rigorous truth-seeking, but rather the age of postmodernism, according to which there really was no truth to be sought. And what this meant is that lacking capital T truth, lacking God as judge of our integrity, there was no higher standard of self-worth. Students became their own arbiters of the standards of their self-esteem. And ultimately, the institutions themselves came to conclude that enhancing this self-esteem, rather than the search for truth, was all too often, they decided, was the role of education itself. And we can actually see this before free speech is fully endangered in a phenomenon that is now everywhere in the academy: grade inflation. Grade inflation. Ross Douthat, in his book Privilege, who describes his time in Harvard, tells us that today, and I'm citing from him, over 90% of Harvard students today make the dean's list, meaning that they had GPAs of B- or higher, and half of the grades given out was A or A-. In 1940, on the other hand, more Harvard students had a C- average than any other GPA. Originally, the most outspoken critic of lenient grading policies at Harvard was a man who's retiring now at the age of 91, Harvey C. Mansfield. C is his middle initial, and he was a very tough grader, and he was known as Harvey C- Mansfield. That's what he was known as. And one day he realized that it wasn't fair, because everyone else in every other class has grade inflation, but in his class there is no grade inflation. But he also felt that he needed to truly give the students the grade that they deserved. He didn't want to penalize them for taking his class, so he made an announcement in class that he was going to give out 2 grades: the official grade, and that would be based on grade inflation, and the private grade, which he would give to the student personally. And he said, the higher grade will be sent to the registrar's office and it will appear on your transcript. And he added, and of course only you will know whether you actually deserve it. Now, while grade inflation might actually have seemed harmless, we have to understand what its source was. And as Mansfield explained, he said that it actually was partially due to, quote, the prevalence in American education of the notion of self-esteem. According to that therapeutic notion, the purpose of education is to make students feel capable and empowered, end quote. The focus on self-esteem rather than a search for truth led to an obvious result, ladies and gentlemen. Students began to claim that they needed to be protected from ideas that they felt to be troubling. And what emerged in Jonathan Haidt's description was an educational approach that, quote, presumes the extraordinary fragility of the collegiate psyche and therefore elevates the goal of protecting students from psychological harm. The ultimate aim, it seems, is to turn campuses into safe spaces where young adults are shielded from words and ideas that make some uncomfortable, end quote. Haidt calls this approach vindictive protectiveness because it actually harms students by shielding them from ideas they find troubling in the name of protecting them and the way they feel about themselves. In other words, where the belief in truth no longer exists, then it is free speech itself that is endangered. But the age of self-esteem was only the first stage, because the postmodern rejection of truth could not last, and this worldview no longer really dominates the academy. We, ladies and gentlemen, are meaning-seeking creatures. That is how God made us. We are formed for faith, for the embrace of something as truth, and the vacuum left by the departure of biblical faith from the academy has meant that an entirely new religion has formed, one with its own dogmas and doctrines, one in which the West is evil, and those that fight against the West and its legacy, agents of the good. Thus, while Haidt may be right that originally the danger to free speech lay in vindictive protectiveness, today a more accurate description comes from the American commentator Heather McDonald, who argued that, quote, campus intolerance is at root not a psychological phenomenon, but an ideological one. At its center is a worldview that sees Western culture as endemically racist and sexist. The overriding goal of the educational establishment is to teach young people within the ever-growing list of official victim classifications to view themselves as existentially oppressed. One outcome of that teaching, she wrote, is the forceful silencing of contrarian speech, end quote. According to the tenets of this new academic religion, the very fact that the university seals proclaim the importance of biblical teachings is itself a reason for opposing them. Because if Hebraic concepts, if Hebrew concepts, were a source of inspiration for the West, then for this new religion, any symbol of Hebraic vitality must be opposed. And that is why, often ironically in the name of freedom, what is sought often in the American Academy by students is the silencing today of the defense of Israel itself. In America, the loss of biblical faith in society and the endangerment of free speech in the academy are often treated, even by conservatives, as two separate phenomena, but they are intertwined because the loss of one value system will always be replaced by another system of dogma. And in the end, ladies and gentlemen, the only way back is a defense of the legacy of the West itself and first and foremost of the American legacy, a rediscovery of what the original symbols and seals of America's institutions of learning once proudly proclaimed. The intertwining of faith and reason. Americans do not need to learn Hebrew like poor, struggling Officer Foskett of Montana. But we do need to rediscover in America the role that biblical tradition played in America, a country that was founded on the notion that there is a truth out there to be sought, and also that this truth is best sought freely. In Uptown Manhattan today, you can visit Columbia University, and you'll see the students of Columbia and Barnard traipsing into the magnificent Low Library on campus. On the foyer floor of the library, as you enter, is emblazoned the Columbia seal, complete with the biblical name of God, Yud-Keh Vav-Keh, with rays of light coming out of it. At least it did originally have it. But over the centuries, as those entering, over the years, have stepped on the seal, have stepped on the name of God, on the floor of the library, the Hebrew letters of God's name have been erased, or at least effaced. It's a metaphor, a painful and perfect metaphor for the fact that many of those overseeing the most celebrated schools in America no longer see faith as essential to pursuit of knowledge and consider biblical belief a curiosity at best and a menace at worst. America's spiritual crisis and the American Academy's intellectual crisis are intertwined. And if it's to be resolved, it's actually here in Yerushalayim that what happens is so important. Because as my friend Eric Cohn of Tikvah has written, It is actually the miracle of Yerushalayim today and the vibrancy of its culture, its Hebraic culture, that serves for so many in America, for so many non-Jews in America, and around the world as a beacon of inspiration that faith can be preserved in the West. Eric, in his own article on the subject, put it this way, and I paraphrase slightly. Jerusalem, the ancient holy city reborn, stands for many as the city of hope, the spiritual center of a Western renewal anchored in the Hebraic moral system. In dark times, Jerusalem renews and rekindles the spirit. The improbable Jewish story, the resurrection of Jerusalem, provides perhaps the most compelling grounds for believing that good in the end will indeed triumph over evil. Jerusalem, forever the Jews' city of hope and once again the West, is now the emblem of our shared purpose to work with faith, political will, and moral resolve to rescue and defend our shared heritage from destruction and decay. In other words, what occurs here, the light that shines here, can illumine lives far beyond Israel itself, providing in its own way a unique fulfillment of the prayer said by Jews every day. May a new light shine over Zion, and may we all merit to share in its luminance. Or chadash al Tzion Tair, v'nizkechu lanu b'mheira li'oro. Ken yehi ratzon. Thank you.